Before you start reading, if you're new here, welcome to Crimson Secrets. Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. We have viewers tuning in from all over the world, and we love seeing where you all are. Now, settle in, because this one is going to stay with you. She did not cry when she found out. That was the part people always got wrong when they heard the story later. They assumed there had been a scene, a broken dish, a slammed door, mascara streaking down a face that had spent 22 years holding itself together in rooms full of people who were watching for weakness. They assumed Helena Mercer had fallen apart the way most people fall apart, loudly and without warning, in the middle of something ordinary. But Helena was not most people. She was 51 years old, the daughter of Reginald Ashworth, not the Ashworth of the name on the file in her husband's desk, the bank that held the account that funded the investment firm that her husband, Rowan Mercer, had spent the last 11 years pretending he had built himself. She found out on a Tuesday, not from a private investigator, not from a friend with guilty eyes and careful phrasing. She found out the way careful women always find out, eventually, from a detail that was too small to bother hiding. A dry cleaning receipt with a charge for a woman's blazer, size 4. Helena wore a 12. She had worn a 12 since the birth of their son, and she had never once been ashamed of it. She set the receipt on the kitchen counter. She poured herself a cup of coffee. She sat down at the table by the window that looked out over the garden that she had designed herself. The one with the stone path that curved just slightly to the left, because she had always believed that a path with a slight curve looked like it was going somewhere worth arriving at. And she thought very clearly, the way she always thought when something important needed deciding. What do I actually know? And what do I only think I know? She knew about the blazer. She knew about the late evenings that had started 8 months ago, disguised as client dinners and board calls that somehow always ran until 10. She knew about the way Rowan had started laughing differently, a little too quickly, at things that weren't quite funny. The laugh of a man performing ease he didn't actually feel. She knew that 2 weeks ago, at the Meridian Foundation spring auction, he had touched the small of her back for the first time. In months, not with affection, but with the practiced attention of a man managing a situation. What she only thought she knew, who it was, how long, how serious. She gave herself exactly 1 week to confirm what she suspected before she did anything at all. It took 4 days. Her name was Petra Linden, 29 years old. Junior Acquisitions Director at a real estate development group that had, in the past 3 years, received 6 figures in advisory fees from Rowan's firm. Helena found this not by hiring anyone, but by sitting quietly at her own desk one evening while Rowan thought she was at her book club, and reading through 2 years of payment records she had every legal right to access because her father's attorney had insisted, 11 years ago, on a financial transparency clause in the partnership agreement that Rowan had signed with a smile and never bothered to understand. Petra was not a villain in the way that word usually gets applied to women in these situations. Helena understood that. She was young, she was ambitious, she had likely been told a version of the story that made Rowan seem more available and more trapped than he actually was. Men in these situations were skilled narrators of their own suffering. Helena had watched her father's business partners do it for decades. Reshape their lives into stories where they were the ones who had been misunderstood, and the women waiting at home were simply fixtures in a house they had outgrown. None of that changed what Helena intended to do, but it did clarify something important. Her anger was not for Petra. Her anger, and it was there, a cold and very specific anger, not hot at all, not the kind that makes you throw things, was for Rowan, for the fact that he had used her family's money to build a reputation he was now trading on. In rooms she wasn't invited into, for the fact that he had looked at the life she had quietly and competently constructed around him and decided it was a platform rather than a partnership. She called her father on a Thursday morning. Reginald Ashworth was 74, sharp as he had ever been, and he had never quite liked Rowan Mercer, a fact he had expressed exactly once at the rehearsal dinner, in a sentence so brief and so perfectly placed that only Helena had heard it. "He's comfortable, with your name, Helena. Make sure he stays uncomfortable enough to deserve it. She had not understood what he meant back then. She did now. Dad, she said, I need 40 minutes. I have 30, he said. But for you, I'll make it 50. She told him everything, not with drama. Not with the particular kind of pain that makes people feel they need to comfort you instead of think clearly alongside you. She laid it out the way he had taught her to present a problem. Facts first, implications second, options third. When she finished, there was a long pause. You haven't told him yet, her father said. It wasn't a question. No, good, don't. Another pause. She heard him set something down on his desk. Probably his reading glasses, which he always held when he was thinking, and didn't realize he was doing it. There's the Hargrove event next month, he said. The foundation dinner. He'll be there. He's already confirmed, Helena said. We both are. Good, her father said again. Then we'll do this properly. The Hargrove Foundation annual dinner was the kind of event that existed at the precise intersection of philanthropy and power that made both seem more elegant than they were separately. It was held every year at the Whitfield Grand, a ballroom that had been restored twice in the past century, and managed to look like neither restoration had ever happened, which was in its own way a form of architectural dishonesty that Helena had always appreciated. Rowan was in a good mood that evening. She had watched him dress with the particular energy of a man who has something to look forward to. At a party, his wife also happens to be attending, a slightly sharper edge to his movements, a hum under his breath that stopped when he caught her. Looking. He wore the navy suit. He always wore the navy suit when he wanted to feel significant. Helena wore black. She wore black, the way she always wore black, not as an absence of effort but as a decision that required no explanation. Her jewelry was her grandmother's, a single strand of pearls and earrings that had been in the Ashworth family for 60 years, and that Rowan had once, early in their marriage, suggested she update. She had not updated them. The ballroom filled the way ballrooms at these events always filled. Gradually, and then suddenly, with the particular low roar of 200 people, conducting 400 separate conversations simultaneously, Helena moved through it with the ease of someone who had been doing this since she was 14. And her father had started bringing her to events like this, not because she was old enough, but because he believed the earlier you understood how a room worked, the better equipped you were to use one. She saw Petra Linden arrive at 7:43. She knew it was her, not because they had met, they hadn't, but because Helena had looked up every photo available, which, in the digital age, was more than enough to form a comprehensive understanding of a person's public self. Petra was attractive in the way of someone who understood how to present herself. Heels that added 3 inches she didn't need. A dress that was precisely calibrated to say, I belong here, without saying it too loudly. She was with a colleague, a man from her firm named, according to the guest list, Helena had reviewed that afternoon, Douglas Whitfield, no relation to the hotel. Petra's eyes moved through the room with the particular combination of confidence and carefulness that Helena recognized immediately. She was looking for someone, and trying to look like she wasn't. Rowan was near the bar. He had positioned himself, as he always did at large events, at the place where the most traffic moved through, which maximized the number of people who would approach him. Without requiring him to approach anyone, he was a man who had built an entire career on making his networking look like magnetism. Helena watched Petra find him, watched the half-second of recalibration on both their faces, the almost look that became a not look, the social performance of two people maintaining distance while remaining acutely aware of each other, across 40 feet of marble floor. She found it, on some level, deeply unimpressive. She turned and walked toward the table where her father was already seated. Reginald Ashworth at 74 had the quality of a landmark. Not because he had been in rooms like this one for so long. That the rooms had shaped themselves around his presence, the way rivers shape themselves around stone. He stood when Helena approached, not from formality but from habit, and kissed her cheek. "You look calm," he said. "I am calm," she said. "Good," he gestured to the seat beside him. "Raymond's here." And Constance. He named 2 members of his board by first name, which was how he always spoke about people who reported to him. Helena had inherited this habit. She had also inherited the understanding of what it meant when her father chose to seat people near him at events like this one. It was never accidental, and it was never about the food. The dinner moved through its phases with the stately predictability of these things. The opening, remarks. The first course, the presentation about the foundation's work. Over the past fiscal year, the video that played to politely moved applause. Rowan was 3 tables away, which Helena knew because she had looked at the seating chart that morning, and quietly confirmed she would not be placed near enough to him to make the evening awkward in the wrong direction. He gave a small toast mid-dinner, as one of the event sponsors. She watched him do it with the practiced fluency of a man who had grown comfortable speaking to rooms he didn't build. He was good at it. She had always known that. It was one of the things she had admired early on. The ease of him, the way he filled a space with apparent effortlessness. She simply hadn't understood for too long that the space itself had been provided by someone else. He found her eyes, during the toast, briefly. The way long-married people find each other in rooms as a kind of reflex, she gave him nothing. Not coldness, not warmth. She simply held the look for exactly as long as was natural, and then she turned to hear something her father was saying. And the moment passed. It was during the dessert course that her father's attorney, a man named Grant Caldwell, who had been her family's counsel for 18 years, and who wore the same self-expression at charity dinners that he wore in depositions, leaned toward Rowan from across the table and said, with the quiet neutrality of someone making a purely administrative observation, "Rowan, there's something I've been meaning to coordinate with you about the Meridian accounts. Nothing urgent, but I'll need about 15 minutes before the quarter closes. Whenever works." Rowan, whose professional fluency never entirely left him, even when he was off guard, said, "Of course. Let's find time next week." "Actually," Grant said, "we should probably get ahead of it. There are some structural changes your father-in-law wanted me to brief you on." The table did not go quiet. Nothing so dramatic happened, but there was a quality of attention that shifted. The specific attention of people who are very skilled at appearing not to listen. Rowan looked at Helena. Helena was taking a sip of water. She set the glass down, precisely without hurry, and she looked at him with the expression she had been composing for 4 weeks, not cold, not angry, not the look of a woman announcing a war. The look of a woman who has already won one, and found the whole thing rather less satisfying than she'd expected, and is now simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up. "I'm sure Grant will walk you through everything," she said. "He's very thorough." Rowan's face did the thing faces do when understanding, ahead of the words that carry it. The slight reorganization, the recalibration, the moment where a man who has been telling himself a particular story realizes the story has a chapter he hadn't read yet. He excused himself to make a phone call. She watched him walk toward the corridor with the specific urgency of a man, trying to look like he has somewhere to be, and she felt her father's hand cover hers briefly on the tablecloth. Not a gesture of comfort exactly. More the gesture of someone who had watched her carry something for a long time and was confirming, without words, that she could set it down now. What Rowan discovered over the next 72 hours, via a series of calls and emails that Grant Caldwell fielded, with the calm efficiency of someone who had been preparing for exactly this, was the following. The Mercer Advisory, which Rowan had spent 11 years positioning as the flagship of his professional reputation, had been operating on a structural foundation that he had in the early days understood as a gift. The $4.2 million in seed capital from the Ashworth Family Trust. The introductions that had opened doors that don't open for people without the right names preceding them. The quiet underwriting of 2 particularly risky years, 2019 and 2021, when the firm had nearly failed, and Rowan had told no one, but had accepted the assistance that appeared, arranged by people he never directly spoke to, because Helena had made the calls and then said nothing about them. He had understood these things at the time, as support, as family money flowing naturally toward family enterprise. He had not sat down and understood, clearly and specifically, that the Ashworth family's investment in his firm was not a gift but a position, one that came with rights and protections that were spelled out in language his original attorney had flagged, and he had declined to discuss. The partnership agreement he had signed 11 years ago at the rehearsal dinner, with a smile, included a clause about financial transparency, and a clause about conduct becoming of a fiduciary, and a clause about actions that constituted material harm to the reputational interests of associated entities. Grant Caldwell did not call it a trap. Grant Caldwell called it, calmly and entirely, without editorializing, a contractual provision that had been triggered by documented evidence of conduct that created legal exposure for the Ashworth family's investment interests. The Ashworth family's investment interests, Grant clarified, had decided to exercise their rights under Section 14 of the agreement. This did not mean the firm was dissolving. It meant that the Ashworth family's position was being restructured, and that restructuring would involve the appointment of an independent board member, a comprehensive audit, and a renegotiation of terms that reflected the current risk profile of the partnership. Rowan called Helena on the second day. She picked up on the second ring. Not the first, that would have suggested she was waiting. Not the third, that would have suggested she was avoiding. Helena. His voice had the quality it always had when he was trying to manage a conversation. Measured, careful. The voice of a man who had learned to deploy reasonableness as a strategy. "I think we need to talk in person. I agree," she said. "Have your attorney call Grant to schedule something." "I meant the two of us." "I know what you meant," she said. "Have your attorney call Grant." She ended the call. Not dramatically, not with a slam of anything or a shake in her hand. She set the phone down on her desk, next to her coffee cup, next to the photo of their son that had sat there for 9 years. And she sat for a moment looking at nothing in particular. She had known Rowan Mercer for 26 years. She had loved him in the beginning, with the kind of love that is so total, it takes years to understand what it was actually made of. She had watched him grow into the shape of the life she had quietly built around him, and she had told herself, for a long time, that watching someone thrive was the same as being thanked. She understood now that it wasn't. Their son, Emmett, who was 23 and worked in sustainability consulting, and had his mother's eyes and his grandfather's precision, found out, not from a family announcement with his grandfather, that Reginald initiated on a Sunday afternoon. Helena had asked him to do it, and Reginald had obliged without commentary, because whatever his views on Rowan Mercer, he understood that a grandmother calling was comfort, and a grandfather calling was information, and Emmett needed information right now. Emmett called Helena afterward. She was in the garden on the stone path that curved to the left. "Mom," he said. "Are you okay?" she said. "Are you actually fine, or are you fine because you've decided to be fine?" She smiled, which he couldn't see. "Both," she said. "They're not mutually exclusive." There was a pause. She heard him breathing on the other end, the specific rhythm of a young trying to figure out which version of himself this moment required. "Grandpa said the firm is going to be restructured." "Yes? And Dad's going to have to step back from some decisions." "Yes? And that's—" He stopped. "That was planned." "Yes," she said again. Another pause, longer this time. "Good," Emmett said. And in the word, she heard something that sounded less like satisfaction, and more like the specific relief of someone who has been watching a situation from a distance and not known whether the person inside it was going to be all right, and has now been given an answer. "Emmett," she said. "Yeah, you don't have to pick a side." "Mom, I mean it. Whatever happens between me and your father, you don't have to perform loyalty in either direction. You're allowed to take your time figuring out what you think." He was quiet for a moment. "I already know what I think, I know," she said. "But I wanted to make sure you knew you didn't have to." The legal process took the better part of 4 months. It was not acrimonious, which surprised some people, and surprised Helena not at all. She had never been interested in acrimony, which was a word that mostly described what happened when people let their pain make tactical decisions for them. She had spent her whole life watching her father negotiate from a position of clarity rather than emotion, and she had understood by the time she was 30, was not because it pressed emotion, but because it gave emotion somewhere to go that wasn't the negotiating table. Rowan's attorney pushed back on several provisions. Grant Caldwell responded to each objection with the specific equanimity of a man who has read everything twice and has the documents to prove it. The restructuring proceeded. The audit was completed. The independent board member was appointed, a woman named Frances Gould, who had spent 20 years in financial oversight and who Rowan had never met and would come to find, in the months that followed, both entirely professional and entirely unmovable. Petra Linden left the real estate firm in September. Helena did not know where she went and did not particularly need to. That chapter had closed not because of any action Helena had taken against her, but because the structure that had made the situation possible, Rowan's access to resources and influence, and the comfortable fiction of his own independence, had been quietly and methodically revised. On an evening in late October, Helena sat at the table by the window with a cup of coffee she had made too strong, the way she had been making coffee her whole adult life, and she looked out at the garden. The stone path curved to the left. The leaves were turning. The maple at the far end had gone fully red, and the light was doing the thing it did in October, low and golden, and somehow both ending and beginning at the same time. She was not happy in the way that people describe happiness in these situations, which is to say, she was not relieved or triumphant or at peace of someone who has survived something and come out. The other side unchanged. She was something more complicated than that. She was a woman who had looked clearly at the life she had built and understood, now, which parts of it had been hers all along, and which parts had been a version of herself she had constructed for someone else's comfort. The parts that were hers. The garden. The work she did quietly on the board of the Mercer Community Trust, which despite its name had always been funded by Ashworth money. The specific way she moved through a room, not performing ease but actually feeling it, which was a thing she had not always known was possible. Her son, who had his grandfather's precision and was learning slowly to trust it. The coffee, the window, the curve in the path. These things were hers. They had always been hers. She had simply for a long time forgotten to notice. People who knew Helena Mercer, the ones who had watched the situation unfold from the polite distance, that people in those circles maintained as a form of social self-preservation, sometimes said, in the months that followed, that they didn't quite understand how she had managed it, how she had gone from the Hargrove dinner to a restructured partnership agreement, to a quietly filed separation without a single visible moment of collapse. The answer, if Helena had ever offered one, which she didn't, would have been simple. She had not managed it. Managing implied controlling something external. She had simply decided very early and very quietly that she already knew the ending. Not because it was certain, but because she was the one who had written most of it, and she trusted herself to write the rest. That was the thing about having spent 30 years watching how a room worked. You stopped being surprised by where people chose to stand in one, and you got very, very good at knowing where to stand yourself.